Hi, everyone. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our office investigates complaints of civil rights discrimination. We combat human trafficking. We ensure equitable language access to county government services, and we build programming to educate on civil rights and social justice and to build community across the diverseness that is our county. With me today as co-host is our wonderful colleague from the library, Dr. Audrey Lau. Welcome, Audrey. It is our pleasure together to welcome you all to another episode of Social Justice in Community, which is a partnership series between our office, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, and the University of Maryland. This series was brought to us by Dr. Chris Marsh, who is completely amazing. And if you're unfamiliar with Dr. Marsh, I just do want to take a moment and do a Dr. Marsh commercial. She has a fantastic book out called The Love Jones Cohort that came out last year and is really, really good. And I recommend everybody get a chance to read it. And she also does incredible work around our county, working with, community police relations. She's done tons of work with our office, and she's really a star. So I also want to thank her for bringing the suggestion for this series to us into the library system. So this series looks at questions like, how does human rights research impact our communities? How does scholarship on human rights violations or issues of social justice have any meaning in our day-to-day lives? And what is being discussed, studied, and thought about in universities today? So we're bringing human rights scholars into conversation about how their work illuminates human rights struggles around us today and what we can do about those struggles. So today we welcome Caitlin Foltz, who is presenting Football and Concussions, Spouses and Caretaking After the Last Snap. Caitlin earned her Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Global Studies, Securities and Justice from the University of Virginia in 2018. She earned her first Master of Arts in Sociology at George Mason University in 2020. Her thesis, The United States' History of Unsportsmanlike Conduct and the Portrayal of Colin Kaepernick, How the Culture Surrounding Football Reinforces the White Supremacist Patriarchy and Nationalism, used context analysis, ethnography, and interviews to demonstrate how the culture surrounding football reinforces ideas of white paternalism and hegemonic masculinity. She earns her second Master of Arts in Sociology from the University of Maryland College Park in 2022, and currently she is pursuing her PhD in Sociology at the University of Maryland College Park. She's working on two research projects. The first project explores the media coverage of WNBA and MNBA athletes' involvement in Black Lives Matter protests through the summer of 2020. And the second project explores gender-based violence in the sports world through the lens of intersectionality. And I have to say, when I read your bio, Caitlin, I said, wow, that is a fantastic bio. When I got to the first MA, I was like, wow, that's really amazing. So it is such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I should probably edit down that bio a little bit, or update it at least. So what I'm going to be presenting today is actually another research project that I've kind of started, but just quick background. I'm a fourth year PhD student at the University of Maryland in College Park in the Department of Sociology. I primarily study gender and race, gender-based violence, usually in the institution of sport. But I also do a little bit of medical sociology, which is kind of what you're going to see today. Just to start, I'm the intern for the NFL Concussion Settlement Players Advocacy Committee. I just want to just as a disclaimer, my research that I'm presenting is independent of that committee, but I pull heavily on what I've learned from the committee. So you can go ahead and pull my slides up and we can get started. So I'm going to be presenting Football and Concussions, Spouses and Caregiving After the Last Snap. I have this set up almost as three parts. And the first part is the settlement. All right. We're going to kind of go through what this concussion settlement looks like, what even is a concussion. And then I'm going to take us through some of the problems with the settlement and then focus on the wives and the spouses and caregiving. So for the settlement, or before we get to the settlement, I want to start off with what is a concussion? What is CTE? We hear both of these words thrown around a lot, especially around football. And I just like to differentiate between the two. So we're all kind of starting at the same starting line. So a concussion is a type of traumatic brain injury, or a TBI, as a lot of people refer to them. And it's caused from a blow or a hit that causes our head and brain to move rapidly back and forth. If you've ever seen the movie Concussion, it has Will Smith in it. He is portraying Dr. Bennet Omalu, who was one of the groundbreaking doctors that really helped push research on concussions and the sort. And there is a scene where in the movie, Dr. Omalu says, imagine if you take like a mason jar and you put like a apple in it, or an orange, or an egg, or something, and you fill it with water, and then you shake that jar. Whatever object you have in there is going to move with it around in that liquid, right? It's going to hit the edges of the jar. And that's kind of what our brain is doing when we get a concussion, okay? Our brain is floating in liquid in our head. It's not connected to our skull. It's connected to a brain stem type thing, but it's not really connected to our skull. So when it shakes, it kind of hits the edges. So that's a singular concussion. That's what's happening, right? CTE is built off of concussions, kind of, right? So CTE stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So a big word. So we'll shorten it and say CTE. And it's a brain disorder caused by these repeated head injuries, right? So the way I think of it, and this is how I think of it as not a medical person, right? I just study the social effects of medicine. So I think of it as, if I think of that object in the jar and it keeps hitting the edges of the jar, right? It's going to get bruises. It's going to get cracks. It's going to have like long-term like injuries to it, right? That's kind of what's happening to our brain with these repeated concussions. And there's this buildup of this tau protein over time. The way I think of it is almost like a callus. If there's something that's rubbing or keeps getting hit, you're going to get a callus, right? It's kind of what's going on in our head, similar to what's going on in our head. And so what happens over time is this tau protein kind of starts to make our brain break down, and we actually lose our brain matter, and this tau protein kind of like pushes it out of the way and takes over its space. Okay. I don't want to say problem or controversy, but with CTE, it can only be diagnosed post-mortem, which means it can only be diagnosed after someone has passed away. They take a sample from your brain and they look at it under a microscope and they say, yes, we see the CTE, we see the tau proteins. Now there's some debates going on about this, right? Like some doctors are like, I don't know, like I probably could diagnose it before then without even seeing the brain scan. Like there are certain traits we'll look for, right? But in terms of the settlement that we'll talk about, in order for a CTE diagnosis to stand in that settlement, it has to be after the player has passed away. So what are symptoms of CTE? And also just if you look on the right, we can see the difference, right, between what a normal, healthy brain looks like versus one that has experienced CTE. We see that degeneration that's gone on. So some of the symptoms of somebody that has CTE is there's mood and behavioral symptoms, and then there's more cognitive or physical symptoms, right? And there's impulse control problems, aggression, mood swings, depression, anxiety, and paranoia. These are all like mood and behavioral symptoms of somebody that is experiencing CTE. Whereas there's more cognitive symptoms where we see like executive function reduced, impaired judgment, short-term memory loss. And then the big ones that we see are dementia and ALS. So we'll come back to these throughout the presentation, but just to start off, these are our main symptoms, right? So the NFL concussion settlement in 2009, there was a group of NFL players that came together and said, you know, they sued the NFL, saying that the NFL knew about concussions. They knew about long-term neurological problems from these concussions, but failed to notify players. And so that started in 2009. It was not settled until July 7th, 2014. And so in this settlement, players who had retired prior to this date were now eligible for compensation. So I always like to point out, if you retired July 8th, 2014, you're not eligible for compensation. So it's a very strict cutoff of who is eligible and who is not. Also, it's important to note that they did not like admit fault during this. They didn't say, yeah, we knew. They settled, right? They took that route out of it. I also like to talk about the definition of dementia here. And this might seem like random, but actually there was just a really good piece in the Washington Post kind of looking at the history of this concussion settlement. And in that piece, they did a really good job describing how the settlement uses a different definition or standard, I guess, for dementia than medical doctors would, right? So if you are experiencing, if somebody says, you know, I think you're experiencing some dementia related side effects, and you go to the doctor, a doctor might diagnose you even if you can still like live by yourself. Maybe you can even still drive a car, but you're just having like small, more reduced symptoms, right? The settlement would not recognize that. You have to go a step further almost, right? So they're using like different definitions. For the settlement, your day-to-day activities have to be interrupted, right? You couldn't be living by yourself. You need to have reminders to shower, to carry out hygiene and things like that, right? So that's a problem for many reasons, but the one for a main reason is when it comes to these neurological diseases, early intervention is so key that in order for these players to even get access to money that might help them get this intervention, they have to be progressed so far that the intervention really isn't going to do a lot for them, right? Because the settlement is saying, if you're still living by yourself, if you're not progressed far enough, we're not recognizing that you have dementia. And so I think that that's a really interesting complication that goes on with this settlement, right? And so part 2 of this presentation is race norming. And why this is important is, so I use the year 2014 for racial demographics because that is when the settlement was first settled, right? So in 2014, if we look at the demographics of the NFL, we see that it was almost 70% Black players, right? About 30%, well, a little less than 30%, 29% white players, and then 3% other, right? So we see how this was overwhelmingly a Black league, right? So this becomes a problem we'll see in the next scene, right? Or the next slide, if I can get it to go. There we go. So when players are getting diagnosed or when they go in to be examined to see if they're eligible for these benefits. And these are made up numbers. I always like to say, these are not real numbers, okay? This is just from how I understand it. So say you go in and you're getting these cognitive tests, and a normal or a healthy brain scale score would be 150. Say that's like your cognitive abilities are great. For white players, they would only make them get a 100 or below. So they'd have to go in, there's some things wrong, but they only have to drop to a 100, right? Black players, they said that they had to score an 80 or below, right? So they had to have more decreased cognitive abilities than the white players. The NFL justified this by saying that it's based off this racist notion that Black people, their Black players, were intellectually inferior to begin with. So they're like, Black players would never have that 150 before they started this, right? Of course, we know this is a racist idea. So they were operating under this until another lawsuit in 2019. So just to bring it all together, I guess, race norming is this practice of adjusting test scores to account for the race or the ethnicity of this test taker. So this is what the NFL was doing from 2014 until 2021. And this is important because, as we saw on this other slide, that's affecting over half of the players that were eligible, right? Making it more difficult for them to access benefits. So then we move into this end of race norming. And in 2021, I think it was 2019 when the second lawsuit was started. In 2021, there was another settlement where the NFL agreed to stop using race norming. And in conjunction with, it wasn't part of the settlement, but in conjunction with the settlement, there was this NFL Concussion Settlement Players Advocacy Committee that was created. That's the committee that I'm the intern for. And this committee is to help advocate for players, help them navigate this extremely complicated process, and kind of work as a way to kind of hold the NFL accountable from doing this again, right? Now, I say "end" in quotation marks because in October of 2023, so 4 months ago, 5 months ago, whatever the time is, it came out that, so there's a concussion settlement and a disability settlement. In this disability settlement, which is separate from the concussion settlement, it came out that they were still using race norming in that disability settlement. So race norming, they say, isn't happening in this concussion settlement anymore, but it's still happening in disability settlements. So it could potentially still be going on in the concussion settlement when we don't know. But they're trying their best to make it very hard for Black players to access benefits, right? So now we move on to caregiving. And thus far, a lot of my presentation, but also a lot of research, talk about the players themselves. And as they should, they're the ones going through this, right? Like, and there isn't a lot of research. There needs to be more on the players themselves as well. But I, in my research, look to move and focus on the wives, because when these players' bodies start to fail them, they need people to help them, right? And that's where the wives and partners come in. So my research that I'm actually starting this summer, going forward, I'm looking to center the experiences of wives and partners and their roles as caregivers. I really want to interview about 60 wives to bring better attention to how the wives are navigating this experience, because they're navigating the settlement alongside their partners. And it's a very draining and emotional process from everything that I've heard, every wife that I've talked to. I also think that this is particularly important when we look back at the symptoms of CTE. When we look at these mood and behavioral symptoms, the impulse control, the aggression, the depression, anxiety, mood swings, these are not covered in the settlement. The only ones that are covered in the settlement are those cognitive symptoms, the more physical symptoms. I think this is particularly important also when we think about caretakers or caregivers, because this is going to directly affect them a lot, right? Like they're going to be at particular risk, especially when we think about impulse control problems and the mood swings and aggression. They're at particular risk for even domestic violence in their house, right? So I think that this is also an extension of not only the NFL not particularly taking care of their players, but also not caring a lot about women, right? And the families that are navigating this system as well. So just before I stop, I just like to put some important links up. If you are a retired NFL player that retired before July 7th, if you have questions about the settlement, there's the settlement's website. And if you need help, I put the Player Advocacy Committee's email there, and you can always reach out. Your information will be kept safe. The chair is really the only one that accesses that email. So if you need help navigating this, they would be more than happy to help. And then also, if you're a wife or a partner or a caregiver and you would like to be included in my interviews, I would love to have you. Just please scan that and fill out the form, and I will be in contact. That's all I have. If you want to take the slides down.
I am going to take the slides down, but I'm not typing quickly enough to get the email address into the chat. So I'm going to leave them up for just one moment so I can copy the email address.
No worries.
I will say my first question has also been asked by one of our viewers. So let me put that up on the screen while I just try to copy his email address down into the comments, which is from one of our longtime wonderful library friends and Office of Human Rights friends, Ms. Vivian. So first of all, hi, Ms. Vivian. Great to see you again. And Ms. Vivian is wondering how you got into this, which was also my first question. Like, how did this become something that you studied? And also, have you written any books?
I have not written any books. There are a lot of great books out there, and I usually include one of them. League of Denial is a really good book. It's written by, I'm not sure if they're academics or just historians, but it goes through the entire concussion history of the NFL and really goes into how the NFL knowingly swerved this this issue, right, and really knowingly did not tell their players about concussions and the dangers and things. How I got involved was actually through Dr. Marsh. So plug for her. But no, we were co-teaching a class together at the University of Maryland. It was Sociology of Race, Class, Gender, and Sports. And this was fall of 2022. And the Players Advocacy Committee had just started. And she had a contact with Ken Jenkins, who is a retired NFL player. He and his wife are very involved in advocating or in advocacy work with the settlement. And Ken came and was a speaker in our class, and then just kind of things fell together where then I became an intern through that. But yeah, that's how I got involved.
Great, thank you. I will say for people watching, we are putting links in the chat where you're watching. So some of the articles that Caitlin mentioned, like the Washington Post article, we put in the chat. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you're able to click that link. We also, League of Denial is in there now. So just check as you're watching, check your chats, and hopefully you can find those direct links so you can get those programs. One of the things, one of our viewers commented that like there's somebody who used to be, really into football and, really walked away from an area where this person was like a pretty serious fan because of the race norming, the harm to players. And so I was wondering, is your research showing, are you seeing a more widespread response to the NFL, negative response because of what's coming out about them?
I think that there's, and I don't think it's just race norming. I actually think a lot of people don't know about the race norming, like what I just presented on. I mean, I don't think anybody would be overly surprised about it, right? But I think a lot of it was more after the treatment of Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed and players like that were trying to protest and how they were treated, or whiteballed or blackballed, whatever you want to call it. I have seen some players move away or not players, but fans kind of shift away from supporting them. I have also just seen a better consciousness amongst some fans. I don't think you're ever going to get all the fans to be conscious of, the corporation that the NFL is. It's probably not as widespread as we might think. And I think that just plays into the power that sports have in society, but especially football in America, where we don't see as many fans leaving as we might think. But there are some, yes, of course.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Did you have a question? Because I don't want to take all the air. You're muted there, bud.
I have not watched football in a very long time. This past Super Bowl was one of the first ones I've watched. And I'm still just amazed after this settlement, after what has come out about this sport that people not only watch, but, their children all through school. I mean, because many of these football players, have been playing since Little League, right. the little ones, and they're wearing helmets and doing hits. And I mean, I know some people don't do the contact, but do you think people are ignoring this? Like, do you think people are just kind of
the concussion side or the race norming side?
Well, I mean, particularly the concussion side. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious the fact that, Black players are affected in, right. just because of the numbers that you're showing. I don't think that's a surprise, but I guess to me, it seems like they're ignoring this concussion aspect, which is really terrible.
I do think that I think the culture is changing some, not enough, but I will say some. Like, I think about when I was young, like I think about on ESPN, they had, I forget what it was called right now, but they used to have a segment where it was like the big hits of the weekend. And it was like glorifying these like very violent hits where almost always the player was severely concussed at the end, right? We don't have that anymore. So I guess that's like one step forward, but that's me being very optimistic. The pessimistic side of me is, sports run so deep in our culture that I think a lot of people don't like, they know about it, but it's like a necessary risk almost, which I don't agree with, but I think that that's how a lot of people approach it, right? I do think that there is more of a push for like delayed playing where kids specifically aren't playing until high school, because that does have an immense impact on like the risk for CTE long term, right? Because we hear about the NFL players that have CTE. What I worry more about, or not worry more about, but what I also think about is, what about these players that, you know, didn't make it to the league, but were still playing their whole lives? Like they're still going to get CTE too. And so I do think about that as well. And then there was something else that I was going to say, but it escaped my head. But the race norming thing. I also think, I think the NFL is a very powerful machine, and we probably don't hear as much about it because they don't want us to. You know, I study gender-based violence as well, and I think about how we don't hear about a lot of gender-based or domestic violence, sexual assault, or whatever from players, because the media a lot of times works with the teams, right? And if you're spreading bad news about the teams, you're not going to get the stories, right? Like it's this cycle. And I think the same thing happens with like concussions. Like if you work for the NFL, like critiquing the NFL probably isn't going to be great for your journalism career, right? Obviously, there are some journalists that are separate and they're very important and do great work, but and then also, I think race also plays into this because, and this is not opening a whole other can of worms, but it could be a whole other lecture itself, right? When we think about like the really racist history of even who plays what position in football, you know, when we think about when teams were desegregated, well, and even today we see more white quarterbacks, right? That the amount of white quarterbacks that we see today is a direct, you know, not responsibility, but lineage from the 60s, right? When we did not, society was really racist and wasn't comfortable with the idea of having a Black leader, you know, telling white players what to do. So a white person was put in that position. When you look at the implications long term, a lot of white players are socialized into positions that are more protected from concussions, right? The kickers, the quarterbacks, right? Whereas a lot of Black players are socialized into positions that are more susceptible to concussions. And I think that that's just another side effect of this, right? Another way that race is playing out outside of race norming even.
Wow. There was a lot.
It's layered.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take a minute because I want to come back with a question on that. But we got a question from a viewer that, and you've touched on this, but I think it's really appropriate to what you were just talking about as well. This person, this is again, so this is someone who shares with friends like about race norming and about the protests that they're making by not watching. That they just can't continue watching football, and this person's experience is that sometimes people are upset at them. They're upset, but they're clinging to this trope that this game is a symbol of America. And so the question, there's a couple of questions here, but like, what, if anything, do you think it will take for people to stand up, like, what is it going to take for there to be a bigger reaction? And then there is a kind of suggestion, which is this kind of similar to the conversation about mass shootings, which is like, oh, it's so terrible, but ... What's your take?
I think just a small question, No, I think it's very similar. I think that, I'm thinking of this because it also relates. I think it relates a lot to what Colin Kaepernick's protest, right? Like people were uncomfortable with him because they said that he was disrespecting America, right? Not looking at what he was doing, or how, first off, America wasn't showing up for him as a Black person, right? And how maybe America did deserve to be critiqued a little bit. And I think that this is just another thing where we are so socialized, particularly in a post 9/11 society, right? Post 9/11, there another lecture, like immense patriotism that made its way into sports, right? Purposefully. And I think that this is all linked, right? Like, there is this like idea that we cannot critique the United States and that we need to do everything that we can to just support them when these institutions aren't supporting us back, right? Whether that be the NFL, whether that be the United States in general, or any other institution, like a lot of times they're not supporting us back, but people aren't comfortable with that because that's not what we've been taught, right? We've been socialized so constantly to not critique these things, right? And so I always say there's power in critique, right? Like when we start, lifting up the rugs and looking for the dust underneath, like that's where you really learn. And I actually was talking with a student last week, like just about, it wasn't really related to this, but I used the example of, this was an athlete. And I said, when you work out, right, if you're not sore, if you're not uncomfortable, you're not gaining muscle, right? And I think that can be applied to so many things. Like if you're not uncomfortable in conversations, we're probably not like learning new things, right? And I think that really applies here as well.
On behalf of the Office of Human Rights, can we steal that phrase?
Go for it.
If you are,
go for it.
That is because that is actually perfect. That idea, like that it's learning can be uncomfortable, growing can be uncomfortable, and that's okay. It's not something to be afraid of. And I think aligning it with exercise or working out is a perfect way to bring that home. So thank you very much for that.
Yes.
Really like that. I have more. I just want to make one more comment. Audrey, I promise I'm going to give it over in one, but I have just one more comment, which is, I had not thought before your presentation about concussion protected roles in football. Mm-hmm. I was aware of the overrepresentation of white players as quarterbacks and as team leaders and therefore the obvious underrepresentation of racist underrepresentation. But I had not thought about the concussion implications of that, the brain injury implications of that, and the idea of these being protected positions. So it's not really a question, but more just really appreciating you higghtlighting that and bringing that.
And I think that's really important too. Then when we think about the race norming piece, right? When we have, the 60% of the league is, Black players, and then they're being socialized or 70% of the league is Black players, and they're being socialized into these positions, right? And then we're making it harder for them to get paid. I see someone in the chat said it's all about making money. I do think money plays a lot into this, but then also who is viewed as expendable in society, and who is not. Like all of this is just so intertwined. Mm-hmm. But no, I agree. I think it's really crazy to think about.
Yeah. Thank you, Audrey. I'm sorry. Please.
You're fine. I was just kind of curious. I don't know if this is the first time you've presented here, but in terms of this topic, but I know as a Civil War historian who used to be at these very male conferences and things, how does you being a woman and talking about football, what kind of comments, like how does that feel like? Because I know
there's actually a really good book where I'm teaching a class with Dr. Marsh right now. It's an extension of the class we taught in fall 2022, but it's more research. So they have to do a research project. But we're reading a book called Sidelined, and it's by Julie DiCario, I think is her name. But she talks about her experience as a woman sports reporter. And I know a lot of women in sports, and they'll all tell you the same thing. It's difficult, right? Like you have to not only know the fact, but you have to have 3 sources to back it up, right? Because they're going to say, I don't know. Are you sure? Like you didn't play this, whatever. It's difficult. You're going to get pushback no matter what, no matter how right you are. But I grew up playing sports, and that was something I was socialized into, like at a young age, that like boys were going to challenge me, whether I was playing, talking about it, whatever. So I don't want to say I'm used to it, because I don't think we should have to get used to it, but it is a very difficult thing to be navigating, right? But usually after they meet me a few times and they realize I kind of do know what I'm talking about, then they back off a little bit. But no, there is an immense amount of like testing that's going on for sure.
Yeah, because you know the positions, you're talking about, technical things that most, I'll say myself included,
Right.
don't always know. So
Well, and I think what plays into that too is, which is the side that not that I like any of it, but that what's most difficult for me, I would say, is if I make a mistake, it's such a bigger deal than if a man would be talking to me and like say the wrong position or whatever, right? I'm in a class right now that I teach 8 football players, and like there was some testing that went on at first, right? But then I think they realized like, no, she kind of knows what she's talking about. Like I might not know like what the plays are called and everything, but I mean, I know the general, like I know the history and I know the technicality of things and the social aspect to it, right? So it's an interesting thing to navigate, but yeah.
do you feel like your research is also motivated by some of the students that you teach?
I think it would be hard not to. I don't think that's what was motivating me getting into it, right? Because I think I was more motivated like to study Kaepernick because of like where I grew up. I grew up in a very conservative area, and I really wanted to understand like why did I like grow up and like this doesn't faze me. I see the like immense like value that this protest holds, but like I studied Fox News and how they were portraying him. And, that's how I kind of got into sport sociology, paired with my own experiences as an athlete. But I think my passion for like race norming and things like that definitely is driven by my students, because the reality is I do have students that will make it to the NFL. We have some that I had last semester that are in the combine right now, right? And so I do, no matter what, I'm like, you all need to have this lecture because I just want you to realize you can get there and it's going to be like money and fame and all this. But I want you to know at the end of the day, the NFL is not protecting you, right? Like you have to go out there and protect yourself. So I think it's passionate in that way too, because I mean, I care about my students. So connecting them and just giving them the knowledge so that they can go on to their next phase of life and like navigate all those systems as well.
Because it's really hard to I know when this came out, it was a big topic. I went to Ole Miss for my graduate career, and there were a lot of sports historians, and this was a big topic of interest, especially we're teaching D1 football students, and it was difficult, because they come into your classroom, after that game, and some of them were, hurting.
Oh, for
and
sure,
it's a hard game, and they don't, D1 is not, it's big time.
It's a job. It really is. It's another job. And I mean, it's definitely motivated by that. So I always try to make sure that they know about this. And the other resource that I always give them is there's a book called $40 Million Slaves, and it's by Bill Roden. He's a journalist, and he writes about this idea called the plantation metaphor, and how professional sports are kind of an extension. It's not a perfect metaphor, but how professional sports are an extension of chattel slavery, because when you look at the power dynamics, if you were to look at who are the owners of the team, which even the idea like an owner, right? Like that language, but who's the owner of the team, who's in administrative positions, those are primarily white people, right? Whereas the players, the labor is primarily Black, right? And the reality is that, yes, we see these Black players getting paid an immense amount of money, but it's never enough money where they're ever going to be able to get into the front office, right? And so it's this idea of these racialized power dynamics that we often don't break down as well.
Great book recommendations, by the way.
Thank you.
Keep it up.
Yeah, we're getting excited over here. And also, it's so wonderful having a librarian as a co-host, because you'll notice all the library catalog things that hit in the chat from Audrey. So thank you very much, Audrey. I wanted to go, I love the fact that you're considering in your research, like the impact on families, on partners. And I know you have a goal of connecting with 60 people. And so I'm wondering, first of all, I don't know if you've started, so please, correct me if I'm off the wrong way here, but
no, I haven't.
How have you found making contact with wives and partners? Are people willing to talk to you? Do they trust you? Like, what's that experience been like?
So I haven't started like interviewing yet, but I have talked to a number of wives that I've made contact with through the committee, right? And I think, I mean, there's always an element of distrust that you have to overcome, no matter what you're studying, right? That rapport that you have to build. But from the wives that I've talked to, most of them just want to be heard, right? Like they're watching their loved one, like their body basically disintegrate away in front of them, right? And it's an extremely painful experience for them, especially knowing that the corporation that they worked for knew this was going to happen, or knew something bad was going to happen and did nothing to protect them, right? And then I've also talked to wives where, unfortunately, this is a very like CTE can cause men to be more violent, right? And hearing those experiences are difficult as well, because there's a safety component, right, to women wanting to take care of their partner and their husband and remembering who they were like before CTE really like took over their body, right? But also like you have safety to consider and things like that, and kids and how that plays into it. So I haven't done any like official interviews, but I've talked with a few wives and read a lot of accounts. So I think it's going to be an extremely nuanced conversation that we'll be having. Yeah. Very emotional conversation as well, but yeah.
I do want to say for people watching at home, if you do have any questions, please type them into the chat where you are watching. We'd love to share them with Caitlin while she's live with us. So please don't be shy if there's something you'd like to find out. And I do have another question from a viewer, which is to do with, and do you know if there is any strategic, outreach to parents or guardians with small children growing up in cultures where football is pushed at a young age? And some children are indoctrinated into believing that this is like their only way out, or they need to have this success.
Right.
Are you aware of any kind of outreach or awareness campaigns?
I'm not sure of like, sorry, I'm looking up an organization right now.
Awesome.
I'm not sure of any like specific targeted outreach. I do know, if my Twitter would work for me, I would tell you, but it's not working. I believe it's the Concussion Legacy Foundation with Dr. Chris Nowinski. They do a lot of great work on concussion, concussion awareness and informing the public and things like that. But I don't know of any like specifically targeted for specific communities. But the Concussion Legacy Foundation does do a lot of great work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Audrey, do you have a question? Or I got another one if you don't.
Go for it.
Ready? Okay. One of the things that you talked about in your presentation was how mood and behavior symptoms are not being covered. And I have many thoughts about that. But I will form them into a polite question, which is, do you know what the rationale? Is there a rationale that is provided? I'm not looking for that's not what I'm saying. I'm trying to figure out, what are they saying about why it's not covered?
I'm not sure their exact rationale. I was actually surprised to find that out. I worked for, I think I'd been working for the PAC for almost a year before I found that out. And I was like, what? Probably if they can blame an action on any other illness or any other cause, they're going to do that, right? ALS and dementia, there is a more linear line to CTE. Anxiety, depression, mood swings, they're like, well, what did you go through as a kid? Did you have trauma? Could that be causing it? I think that there was one, the Washington Post article, I believe that's where I read that there was somebody that had a bipolar diagnosis. And they were like, well, couldn't that be causing it? Like, we don't know. And so there is like if they can put like an ounce of doubt on something that maybe this isn't related to CTE, then they're not going to cover it, right? So those cognitive things, the more physical manifestations, there's a stricter line, whereas these mood and they're more fluid ideas, right? So they're like, well, maybe, there's other issues that could be causing that. And like we saw, like even with the more like straight line ones, like dementia and CTE are so connected, right? They're like, okay, well, we're not going to cover it if you just, have these minimal symptoms. We're waiting till you get like extremely advanced in your dementia before we'll agree to cover it.
What do you think why is that? And you may have told us in the presentation, so forgive me if I don't remember. What's the rationale? And again, I'm not asking you to defend the position. I just want to...
Right. No, for letting them, for the different definition.
Right, and for being so severe.
Because they can blame it on anything else. They can say, is this real? I don't know. Is it like, could this be anything else? If there's an ounce of doubt, they're going to take that as an ability if there's an ounce of doubt, a possibility that it could be anything else, they're going to take that because then they don't have to pay the player.
Right.
The more I'm in this, the more I realize how much it really is a lot about money. And I think there's also a point of, I think money is a key motivator. I also think admitting fault, like the more players they pay, the more like, I think that's probably a minor thing, but I do think that plays into it.
I'm apparently having Vulcan mind meld with viewers now, because not only did Ms. Vivian get my first question down, but we have another question from a viewer, which follows up on a question that I had poised.
Okay.
So I'm from Canada. And so of course for us, it's hockey, right?
Right.
And I was wondering about this with hockey, but the question I have from a viewer here is, do you know of a similar study regarding traumatic brain injuries and dementia has been done in the United Kingdom with rugby? And I will add in my question, which is, or in Canada, I mean, not that people in America don't play hockey. I'm not trying to upset anybody, but do you know about other sports in other nations?
Yeah. So, and my Twitter did work for me this time. It is the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and it is Chris Nowinski. They do work on TBIs in rugby. They do TBIs in hockey. Any of these sports where there's going to be like these repeated hits, you are at risk. And so football is the one that we hear about a lot, because especially where we live, right? The United States, like there's no sport bigger than football. But outside, I mean, soccer with headers and things like that, like you're also at risk. So I would recommend checking out the Concussion Legacy Foundation. They have a lot of information. And Dr. Chris Nowinski, he was a player in the NFL. He went on to wrestle in the WWE and then got his PhD. And he's an expert on this. So any work that he does, or the Concussion Legacy Foundation, they do great work as well.
I guess I was going to ask if you had a sense of the portrait of the people who were part of this, the lawsuit in particular. I mean, we see pictures at the Super Bowl of, Joe Montana and all these, kind of well-known football players. But is that the picture? Who are these people that are part of this? What are their lives going? Where are they? Are they? We've seen players that have been homeless,
right,
some who have committed suicide.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of. But I'm just kind of curious: is there a way for you to kind of break down even the people in this? Because like Joe Montana looked fine.
Well, I actually, one of my last slides that we don't need to show it or anything, but actually. Way before this, right? Troy Aikman's agent was one of the ones that was really kind of like sounding the horn. And that was back in 1995 and was like, something's going on. Like, can y'all pay attention? So that was 1995. I don't know the exact list of players to say. I do know that there was one larger name that they write about in the Washington Post article, but I can't remember off the top of my head who it was. But all the stories that you that you just referred to, I mean, they're ones that I've heard. I've heard of players dying by suicide. I've heard of homeless players. I've heard from the wives of like the state that their husbands are in. And yeah, I mean, there's a large range. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, they really don't get help until they have progressed too far. But yeah, there's a large range.
I'm wondering if, back to the progression and your focus on families, on partners, domestic partners, like how, and you said in your presentation, it's indicative of the way that the league doesn't care about women, again, because presumably, most of the caregivers, not necessarily all, but most of the caregivers are women, that you're looking at. And one would suppose that there's, if the labor of caregiving, not only the work labor, but the financial labor is downloaded to these women, it's also another way that the league doesn't have to take responsibility.
Right.
And I'm wondering, are you seeing, is there movement among caregivers and spouses, or is there potential movement for spouses and partners to come after the league, like as a separate entity?
I haven't heard of like their own lawsuit, I guess, or their own like movement per se, but I will say, like, the wives that I've spoken to and the partners I've spoken to, they are like the most amazing people I've talked to, and they are so interconnected. And it definitely is like a sisterhood for sure. I haven't heard of like an official movement or anything, but I do know that the wives, they are very interconnected, very supportive of each other. So it wouldn't shock me if they had grounds for that. It wouldn't shock me if they would do that. But I haven't heard of anything officially, no.
Right. All right, Audrey?
I just want to know if you're going to interview Taylor Swift.
I don't think so. No, I'm not going to interview Taylor Swift, but actually we just tweeted about Travis Kelce. We have a Twitter for the PAC, or we didn't tweet, but one of our members tweeted, and they pointed out that right now, everybody loves Travis Kelce, right? But 20 years down the line, if he's having issues from a concussion, like the NFL is not going to care that he's Travis Kelce or that he's dating Taylor Swift, right? Like that he's still going to have issues he's not eligible for these benefits, but getting, help for his concussions, right? The league isn't going to care. And I've had similar discussions in my class with the example of Lamar Jackson, right? Like, we love Lamar now. We think he's great, but 20 years down the line, like, the NFL is going to be like, sorry, bud. Like, they're not going to help him, unfortunately. And that's how they treat, all of their players.
So one of the things that we do, we do a lot of programming with the Office of Human Rights, and this series also, is looking at, okay, what are the impacts on our community? Mm-hmm. And in general, we also look at like trying to give people takeaways, right? Like, okay, you've watched this program, what's a takeaway? So I'm thinking about when I'm talking about a beloved sport,
right?
And we are talking about the implications of the sport, full stop. Mm-hmm. And then also the implications of a lack of care of the league. So people you're watching right now, you're like, but I love football, right? I can put myself in those shoes but I love hockey, right? Like I can really actually feel that with a lot of compassion, truly. So I'm wondering for you, Caitlin, like, what is a takeaway you can give, people who are like sports fans who like love this sport, whatever that sport is, where they, what's a takeaway for them about how they can advocate or.
Right. I think the best thing to do is just to not be a blind supporter or a blind fan, right? And I think that applies to a lot of things in life, right? Whether that's a blind support for country, for team, for organization, right? I think really keeping your eyes open and paying attention to how this organization might be putting your favorite player at risk, right? Or even just educating yourself on concussions. And if you have like younger boys and girls in your family, and like thinking about the implications of long-term on their health if they play football, right? Like, I'm the same way. I love watching football, but whereas when I was younger, I was socialized to, you see a big hit and you're like, oh, that's awesome. Right now I have a very different reaction. I see like the slightest bit of a hit and I'm like, oh God, what's happening? Right? Like, is he okay? And I think just changing your mindset as you're watching to be a more critical consumer is really important and really powerful too. because I think all of these organizations, and this example is the NFL, they gain their power by people not knowing, by people not paying attention. And so we can take back some power by even just knowing and learning about the harm that they are causing.
Right. Did you have another one? Oh, okay. I do have one to close out. We're almost at time here. But and I'm a little concerned you've said this and I have forgotten. So please share again. What are you hoping your outcome of your research will be?
That's a really good question. I just see a lot of times where women, kind of relating to the question you asked me, Audrey, where women are written out of sport, right? Whether it be they're playing the sport, whether they're supporting as doctors, as coaches, or in this case, as caregivers. I just want to amplify voices that are really not being amplified, right? Like, we're not hearing these stories. And I think that they might have some of the most powerful stories, right? Like, they are getting to be advocates for, their spouse or partner that towards the end of their life cannot advocate for themselves. And I think that that's a really important message to amplify. I also know that I don't know the racial marriage, like what that looks like amongst NFL players, right? But I do acknowledge the women that I've talked to are Black women, right? So how are Black women even more being marginalized in the society, and how can I amplify their voices and their experiences in this particular situation?
Right. Well, thank you very much, because it is very interesting, and you have genuinely, there's things that you've said today that, as I said before, that I had not considered.
Thank you.
So I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Your presentation was awesome. It was really interesting.
It was.
Thank you.
And so I will say also, please keep us in mind. We'd love to have you back if there's, if we can, have you for another program. You have some research coming out. We already know Ms. Vivian's looking for a book. So make sure that you keep us in mind for those things. And we'd love to highlight more work that you're doing. For everybody watching at home, thank you so much for joining us. We are doing this every single week between now and the first week of May, except for February 29th. So please join in every Tuesday. It is not Tuesday. Join in every Thursday at 2 p.m. as we continue with social justice and community. I also want to let you know that tonight you can join us at 7 o'clock in partnership with the library for a very, very cool event called Musical Connections, where we are meeting with two people who have been united across time and space over love of music. And we are looking at how did a woman in Massachusetts come to give over a 100-year-old violin that belonged to her father to a man in Prince George's County. So we're going to have both of those people with us tonight, and it's going to be a really wonderful conversation. We hope you join us. You can check out all of our programming, civilrights.mypgc.us, and also check out what the library is doing. They have millions of events all the time, pgcmls.info. Again, thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Caitlin. It was awesome. And of course, Dr. Marsh, thank you for the gift that you are to the county and for this program. It's been really, really good.
Thanks for having me.
Bye, everybody.